Mr. Coe, do you have, or I'm sorry, Chairman Coe, do you have any comments?
No, just, I have a good suggestion for you. Just keep things moving along here today and we'll be fine.
All righty, thank you. I'd like to remind everybody to turn down your cell phone. I just heard mine go bleep bleep, so it reminded me to get cell phone turned down. Ted, anything on your table?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I've got the roll call sheet ready to go.
Oh, that'd be great.
All right. Senator Ellis. Senator Pappas.
Here.
Senator Rothfuss.
Excuse. No, hey, he's on the phone. Yeah, Chris, are you on the phone?
No, that's meeting. Yeah.
Chris, are you on the phone? Well, he's gonna be.
Yes, I'm here, thank you.
Oh, he is
I
here.
had it on mute, so we'll put it back on mute, so.
Okay.
Morning, everyone.
Morning.
Senator Wasserberger. Representative Bovee. Representative Brown.
Excuse.
I'll do the floor, can you hear me?
Brown's there?
No.
Okay.
Okay. Representative Flitner. Representative Freeman.
Excuse.
Representative Kinner.
Here.
Representative Paxton.
Here.
Representative Peeperinen.
Here.
Representative Simpson.
Here.
Co-Chairman Coe.
Here.
Chairman Northrup.
Here. Thank you. All right. So, still getting my act together here. All right. So we'll start out with. No wonder I was on the wrong page. Here it is. Department of Audit, and they're going to be talking about school finance audits. Justin Chavez.
Morning.
Good morning.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Justin Chavez, School Finance Audit Manager for the Department of Audit. And I'll be going through an update of the audits that we have completed in the last year since we did this last year's meeting. And what you'll see is really similar to what you saw last year. A couple of reasons for that. Last year at this time, I presented partial results for 2 statewide audits that we were in process of. And so what you see here at the beginning of this is updated results for those 2 audits. So we've got updated numbers on pages 3 and 4. And so a lot of this information presented last year. We just didn't have all the districts completed when I presented. And so I have updated numbers and updated totals for those 2 statewide audits. But we had completed enough of the audits to know what the major issues were in those audits. And so the issues that have been identified are all the same ones that I presented last year. Same thing with the full audits. We have numbers for the full audits that we've completed or substantially completed, but the issues that are identified are really the same ones that were presented last year. If you look at the tables on pages 5 and 6, with the highlighted percentages, you can see that the same areas tend to generate the majority of the dollar findings in our audits each year. And so the issues that I presented last year are all still present in our current audits and are generating most of the dollar change. So I can go through those issues again in detail if you'd like, or I could take questions, whatever the committee would prefer.
Why don't you go through them real quick?
Okay. So on the retention and retirement audit that we completed, so there wasn't a whole lot of issues with retention. There were very few districts that had overlap between being reimbursed for that and also claiming it on the 401 or 103. The bigger issue was retirement, in which the amount of reimbursable retirement was calculated incorrectly. Probably the biggest driver of that is almost all districts would export their payroll system data to a spreadsheet and then calculate the adjustment to retirement manually. So we saw formula errors, calculation errors, so issues like calculating the retirement adjustment based off of all pay instead of only retirement eligible pay. So I pay like leave payouts or bonuses or stipends or reimbursements, none of those are subject to retirement. And so we would see that quite often where those amounts would be included in the calculation for making retirement adjustments. And then probably the other thing we saw most common was using the wrong percentages in the retirement adjustment. Statutorily, only 12.69% of the retirement is reimbursable on the 401 and the 103. And what we would see particularly for districts that were backing off a non-reimbursable percentage, we would see not the correct percentages used because a portion of retirement isn't reimbursable at all. A portion of it's reimbursable separately on the 109, and then the 12.69% is reimbursable on the 103 and the 401. And so we would see incorrect percentages used in making that determination. Onto the vocational ed statewide audit. Common issues we see is including courses that haven't been approved for funding in the reimbursement worksheet, and also the opposite. It's fairly common to see courses that have been approved for funding and were offered and had kids enrolled that didn't make it onto the reimbursement worksheet. Not using the correct snapshot date in terms of the enrollment that's reported on those worksheets. Not accounting for varying class lengths on schedules where some days may have longer classes than others, and then counting classes that are taught concurrently as multiple sessions. So say I teach welding 1 and welding 2 in the same room at the same time. That's one class session for the purpose of funding, but we do see where those will be reported as 2 class sessions for a teacher. And then on to the full district audits. Payroll tends to be a recurring area where a lot of our percentage-wise, our dollars are generated. So same issue as the retirement statewide audit. We see incorrect retirement being claimed for reimbursement. Another large driver is time and effort documentation. So if you have a salaried, say you have a counselor and they're salaried, but they only spend a portion of their time in special ed, we see documentation related to that. So there may be missing documentation, there may be poor documentation, and so that leads to us only being able to substantiate a portion of the FTE that was claimed, and then also calculation issues themselves, just with adding wrong or doing the math wrong, or we'll see that FTE based off of school days instead of contract days. Teacher experience, so we see from year to year the same differences in teacher experience on the 602 with, so say for example we audit a teacher on a prior audit and we determine the difference in experience. We get to the current audit, we see that same difference in experience. And then the updating of education levels, that seems to be less in current years, but that does generate more dollars typically than differences in experience. So it's fairly common to see, for example, a teacher that has a master's degree, but it was reported as a bachelor's degree on the 602. And then at risk issues such as including students that weren't approved for free and reduced lunch by the October 1st snapshot date. Again, same with FTE calculations. We see incorrect math on the application. One thing that we tend to see, for example, is if the household has members that have income on different frequencies, so say one person is paid biweekly and another person is paid monthly or weekly, you're supposed to annualize all of those amounts and then add them together. It's fairly common for us to see a conversion factor applied to those. Classified as monitored that have never actually been tested as English language learners. So you can't be in monitored status if you weren't first in ELL status. To a lesser degree, we've seen issues where if we have a student that's ELL in one district and they transfer to the other, that status can transfer, but sometimes the documentation doesn't always transfer, and then we're not able to substantiate that they qualified for ELL. And then inaccurate school entry and exit dates on the 684, which factors into the calculation of mobile students. So those are the three areas that, like I say, you can see from the tables and numbers on the full audits that tend to make up the majority of our dollar findings from year to year.
Thank you. Questions for Justin? Go ahead, Representative Peperinen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chavez. How deep are full-fledged audits for the district? How granular do you go that you might discover discrepancies, let's say, in credit cards?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Peperinen. So we look at, on say the expenditure side, we will take all the expenditures that were included in the amounts reported for reimbursement, and we will pull a random sample of that and look at it. So if there happens to be credit card expenditures that come up in our sample, we will then look at the credit card statement and compare that to the purchase order, the statement, the invoice for that expenditure, and the check. So we do get down to the individual expenditure level when we're looking at expenditures.
Further questions? Representative Flintner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Justin, are you, is this normal to see these kinds of discrepancies in the district, their accounting practices?
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Representative Flintner. To see, so in the expenditure side, non-payroll, we probably don't see a lot anymore. If you look at the tables, the percentage of transportation or special ed regular expenditures, our differences there are usually quite a bit less than if you're looking at, say, the payroll for those two areas.
Follow-up?
Go ahead, follow up.
I just wondered if you felt it was necessary to have better education with your districts so that everybody was kind of on the same page with all of this.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Flintner, I think particularly in special ed, the types of expenditures that are or aren't reimbursable can be kind of a fuzzy area or a gray area. That might be helpful to have some discussion in that area as to what is or isn't reimbursable.
Further questions from the committee? Anybody? Thank you, Justin.
Thank you.
We'll take public comment on this section. Anybody for public comment? Going once? Going twice? Nobody? All right. We're going to move right along and go to, see, we're ahead of schedule.
You learned from Hank. For a while. For a while.
We're going to do K-12 special education fiscal efficiencies. Megan Degenfelder and Shelley Hamill. I don't get very many digs in on the chairman, so I got to get him when I can.
paybacks would be tough, though.
All session long. Good morning, ladies. How are you doing?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Megan Degenfelder and Shelley Hamill with the Department of Education. You will recall that at the June and September meetings, the department provided updates on fiscal efficiency work as well as recommendations on special education expenditures. And today, we will further update the committee on a few areas, including the proposed Chapter 44 agency rules, the proposals and our work with the Government Efficiency Commission, staffing guidelines, as well as historical special education child counts. So beginning on your memo, page 1, with Chapter 44 proposed rules. This actually dovetails nicely from Mr. Chavez's answers to Representative Flitner. You'll recall that the Chapter 44 proposed rules are meant to replace the Chapter 8, Section 11B agency rules for special education reimbursable expenses. The goal of the proposed Chapter 44 rules is to provide greater clarity around what is and what is not reimbursable under special education expenditures. Some areas with additional clarity include supplies and equipment, professional development, technology, etc. These proposed rules were vetted through several stakeholder groups, including the School Finance Data Advisory Committee, the Association of Special Education Administrators, as well as a Special Education Efficiency Task Force. The public comment period was opened from August 20th to October 5th, during which time we received 2 public comments. On October 4th, the Association of Special Education Administrators requested a public hearing regarding the rules, which we hosted on October 23rd. During that public hearing, we received 8 comments. 3 were not relevant to Chapter 44, and the other 5 represented concerns that were really more of misunderstanding of the rules, as well as some minor wording changes. Responses were submitted to all of those comments, and no substantial changes were made to the rules. State Superintendent Jillian Balow approved those rules, which are now within the governor's office for the 75-day review process. Moving on page 2 to our work with the Government Efficiency Commission. The governor's office contracted with Alvarez and Marcel in October to begin its efficiency work. The Phase 2 efforts will include the 2 proposals, which we have updated you on previously regarding education. These include Medicaid reimbursements for special education, as well as a K-12 shared service center. The contractor has rolled out their design phase. They have quite an aggressive time frame for their rollout and implementation. We're not sure when exactly that work will be completed, but we will continue as an agency to work diligently with the contractor to follow through with those recommendations and the roadmap. Next are the staffing guidelines at the bottom of page 2 and onto page 3 of your memo. At the September meeting, we updated the committee on our work to develop statewide staffing guidelines. Since that time, we have met with stakeholder groups in order to develop staffing guidelines for both certified and classified staff. These staffing guidelines are really a hybrid of efforts and practices from other regional states, as well as current practices within Wyoming and feedback from those stakeholder groups. We are continuing to work on finalizing those guidelines as well as our monitoring protocol, and we are confident that those staffing guidelines will be fully implemented by the January 1 deadline. Mr. Chairman, the last area of update is regarding the historical special education child counts. And if I can direct you to the appendices to the memo, Appendix A outlines the special education student counts. These are outlined by district from FY 2012-13 to 16-17. Turning to Appendix B, you're provided with the special education child count by disability. These are again by district and then individual disability type. You'll see it also includes the total special education enrollment as well as percentage special education enrollment in each district. Mr. Chairman, Appendix C includes the child count by disability percentages similarly. And lastly, Appendix D, the special education child count by grade. Those are grades kindergarten through 12 in each of the 48 school districts. Mr. Chairman, that concludes our update on special education efficiencies and data, and then we are happy to answer any questions that the committee may have.
I think probably that one of the questions that the committee has is tell us about how the cap has worked out on special education. Are we nearing the cap, or is there money left over? What's the projection looking like?
Sure, Mr. Chairman, at this point, we do not have projections. You may recall that the cap will be based on expenditures in 17-18, or in other words, the amounts reimbursed in 18-19. And so unfortunately, we will not know those numbers. We'll have preliminary numbers in August of 19. Those will be finalized by December. We're still finalizing the numbers from this past year. And so we're unable to provide those estimations. However, we are completing the rules for the $2 million appropriation, which will be allocated to districts that have increased their out-of-district placement expenditures, as well as their total special education expenditures, and they will be eligible for that appropriation based on their proportion of increases comparatively statewide.
Okay. Okay. Further questions? Further questions from the committee? Go ahead, Representative Bovee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have this document that's from the WISO, and in it they talk about cuts. There's a concern about the cuts that were made to the CDC and at-risk funding, but also DFS funding. Can you, first of all, I've heard rumor of what the cut for DFS funding is, but can you tell me how much that was?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Bovee, we don't have those numbers available. I can certainly see if we have access to them, but not at this time.
Okay. Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead, follow up.
Then I just have one comment to make. My understanding is that the cut for reimbursement to Medicare for children who are placed in out-of-district placements for behavior issues has been cut to 65%. And I have a major concern about that because there's a whole bunch of information about where our kids are with behavior issues anyway that's on this document. And the cut to $65 for Medicaid reimbursement will mean that there are many out-of-state placements that we currently use that will no longer take their kids because that's not adequate funding. So I just want to express that concern.
Thank you, Representative Bovee. Anybody else got any questions or comments? All right, none appearing.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go to the Wyoming Association of Special Education Administrators, and Alan and Dan, I won't even try to pronounce last names because I'd slaughter it, so.
Chairman and members of the committee, I'm Alan Demeray, I'm the Director of Special Services in Sweetwater County School District No. 2 and also the current president of the Wyoming Association of Special Education Administrators. And this is Dan Mayer, and he's the Executive Director of Region 5 BOCES. And first, we want to thank you for the opportunity to visit with you today regarding numerous items. Obviously, the elephant in the room, which is special education funding, and I think many of you have got some questions regarding some of the efficiencies that you'd like to explore, also maybe some perceptions about special education in our state. And really, we're looking at this opportunity as a chance for you to ask us questions from folks that are in the field. So if, as we go through, you've been provided with a document. I know that the timeline for that wasn't, you didn't have a whole lot of time to look at it. Unfortunately, it's not that easy to create all these documents while we're also trying to fulfill our responsibilities in our districts. But hopefully it'll give you some ideas on what we want to cover today, and we'll kind of go through that document with some of those concerns that have been shared. And I appreciate that some of you have already taken the time to look through that, as I think these are definitely items that have been brought up before, and we want to make sure we provide you with some information. So I'll apologize in advance if I don't follow the proper decorum in responding to some of you. I am looking at this as a dialogue, and so if I don't address you properly, I'll apologize in advance for that, as I'm in the kid business, so we don't follow those addresses that often. So, Dan, did you want to say anything before we get started? Great. So really, our intent today is to cover a few things. One is to talk about how our students are currently doing. We hear quite often, you know, are we getting the most for our buck in our educational system? So we provided you with a couple data points that I think are important to highlight, especially as it reflects to outcomes. Another area we're going to be addressing is those perceptions about things that maybe are going on in special ed and why are they the way they are. Maybe they're in dealing with federal statutes, maybe they're state regulations that are in place, and we want to kind of give you an opportunity to ask some questions about some of those perceptions as well. We want to talk about oversight. I think that one of our concerns as directors in the state is really some of the efficiencies that we're discussing here may be addressed through oversight rather than additional regulations, additional statutes, additional laws in place. And so I think that's important to highlight, as well as also what are some current efficiencies that we as directors see that maybe haven't been explored, or how can we explore those to try to get that funding down a little bit, so that, or the cost, the expenditures down a little bit, so that we can try to help you as your task of getting education funding down. So that's kind of our goal here for the short time that we have. Chairman, I'm not sure if you have questions to start off before we get going.
I don't. Anybody in the committee have any questions, comments? Proceed, please.
Great, thank you. So the first piece is really taking a look at some of those data points on how our students are doing. And when we look at special education, we often forget that these kids are general education students first. And so we like to look at our numbers and look at our proficiency rates from our state assessment and say, wow, our students with disabilities aren't doing as well as they should be. Around 20 to 25% of them are proficient on the state assessment. I think it's important to note that students that are doing well when they're in special education, as they become proficient, are also evaluated to be exited out of special education. Therefore, they don't get to count towards those numbers of students that are either proficient or not proficient because they've been exited. So what happens is we evaluate students in as we evaluate students out, and that number stays fairly consistent, as you'll see later on in our presentation. I think it's important that when we look as a whole, all of our students in Wyoming are doing fairly well. NAEP has shown us that our students are top 5 in the country on many different areas. Our state assessments are showing that our students are progressively doing better. And I think that that's what we're aiming at, is looking at that continued growth for our students. We've got a great tool this year with the Y-top. It's showing us growth measures, which I think has been something that our districts have been looking for a long time. It's hard to look at longitudinal data when our assessment has been different from year to year to year and how it's been delivered from year to year to year. So we like to look at those numbers, but we've got to be cautious with how we analyze those numbers. I think another piece to look into is, as we go through, our post-secondary outcomes. This is a huge factor for directors in how are our students doing once they leave high school. Many of our students with disabilities may not go to college. They may go right directly into the workforce. They may go into the military. They may go into a different avenue than your traditional four-year university. The research and the data that the WDE collects each year is telling us that over 70% of our students annually are meeting those post-secondary outcomes, meaning that when we follow up with those students a year after they've left high school, they're either employed full-time or they're enrolled in a university or a two-year college. That's really an outstanding measure that I think gets forgotten sometimes to mention because we get so concerned about proficiency scores. We need students that are going to be providing to our communities, that are going to be outstanding citizens, that can be independent on their own care, and that's what we're doing. So I think we don't want to lose sight of that. Yes, Representative.
Go ahead, Representative Bovee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When you talk about those numbers, the 70%, are those kids who graduated on an IEP, or are they kids who were, do they include kids who've been on IEPs earlier and were exited out of special ed?
Chairman, may I respond?
Go ahead, please.
Great question. So these are students that when they graduated were on an IEP. Because if they're exited, say, as a junior, then they'll no longer count towards that count. Now, some of these students may have been to high school 5 years, 6 years. Some of them may have gone all the way through their 21st birthday. So some of these kids, obviously, it takes a while for them to get through our programs, but they're still getting out there and they're still having meaningful careers or employment or going into school, which is our goal for all of our kids. Hopefully that answers your question. Great. The next piece of data I think it's important to look at is our discipline data. And this is removals of students. Again, all of this information was found from the Fusion website on the WDE website, so you can definitely fact check us if you'd like us to. But I think it's important that we take a look at discipline of our students means, are we keeping those students in our classrooms, in our schools? Are the efforts that we're providing for interventions working for our students, especially those kids with behaviors? And I think that these are showing us that overall, we're not just sending kids home. We're addressing those issues at school. We're doing our best to making sure that we have proper classroom management. And this is an entire educational piece, not just a special education component. This is how are our teachers in general education classrooms addressing students with disabilities. This is how our district culture is changing to where we're including more and more kids in our classrooms. So this is really a kudos to all education, not just students with disabilities, that we're saying, hey, we're not just sending kids home. This is saying that we're not just sending the problem back to the home, we're taking care of it in our home, in the school. I think it's important that we take a look at that in terms of long-term expulsions as well. There's a big trend, I think, as you discuss with directors, of not just putting kids back on the street if they've done something that maybe could be seen as an expulsion for a disciplinary act. We're trying to work with families on getting those kids back into school, giving them the supports they need, giving them the resources they need to address the problem, rather than just saying, for a year, we're going to forget about you and then come back. I think districts have been very creative in coming up with ways to address that issue. The parent survey is another one that the WDE sends out. In all honesty, they only probably get around 20 to 25% return rate, which I think is fairly common for a lot of surveys, especially when you send it out to all parents throughout the state of Wyoming. But it's telling us that 80% of those parents that fill out the survey feel like they were involved in their child's education. They were a part of that facilitation of that IEP plan. That's an important piece, because as we know, we continue to discuss the issues with dispute resolution, with due process, with litigation around special education. This is telling us that our parents are pleased with the services that their kids are getting. Again, I think these are important facts that we've got to bring out there, because they all make a piece of that puzzle that we're trying to figure out of what's wrong with special education in Wyoming, how do we fix it, how do we become more efficient about what we do. I think we need to highlight that what we're doing is working. So be careful with some of the unintended consequences of cutting here, cutting there, because we're getting results. And that's what we've been asked to do. We're getting that done. So I think we want to make sure that we don't lose sight of that as we move forward. Dan, anything as I go? I know I'm used to talking a lot, so I'll keep going.
Oh, I'll chime in. So.
All right. Great. So that's a little bit of data regarding how our students are doing. Obviously, it's just a skimming the surface. There's a lot more data out there. I'm not sure if you have questions specifically on current kind of outcomes for our students before we move into some of those concerns that have been brought up to us from a variety of constituents.
Questions from committee?
And I would just add to that each year we have 20 indicators that the State Department reports to each of our districts, and they have these 20 indicators. So we have a lot of data that's collected on our students, from graduation rates through, as Alan was talking about, post-secondary outcomes. So we're very data rich and can be shared on how we look at that, because they have to report that to, I believe it's OSEP. So.
Please continue.
Great. So one of the first concerns we hear a lot is, why do we have so many students in special education in the state? We are over-identifying kids. We have way too many. Our percentages are out of control. And this being tied back to, if we're going to give you as many funds as you want, then obviously you're just going to go out there and evaluate every kid, and you're going to provide special education services to every student out there. What we've done is taken a little bit of the same data that the folks before us had looked at the WDE and shown you that our numbers really haven't fluctuated. Our numbers in special education have remained the same. and they're very close in line with what our national average is. We're right above the 13%, around 14% as a state in identification rates. The national average is around the 13%. So that's telling you that even though we're 100%, which we're one of the only states that do this, we're not out there trying to find every kid, even if they don't need services, and making them eligible to providing them with services. There are federal rules, there are statutes that are in place, and I'm going to allow Dan to kind of talk a little bit more about that, because as a school psychologist, that was his role. As a director, I would hire Dan and I would say, you need to go out and you need to follow Child Find to go find those kids that need services, but then we have to follow certain rules as to how we identify them. So Dan, if you'd like to kind of discuss that a little bit.
So it starts off, we have federal requirements of Child Find, which means that if we have concerns for children, either parents or the school themselves will refer that child to us, and we will evaluate. If we have a reasonable suspicion that they may have a disability, we'll get those kids and we will evaluate them, and I'm going to go into that. So there's a whole process on this Child Find idea. That process really begins in infancy with our child development centers, which was discussed at the last session. And I would be curious, one piece of data I would ask from the WDE is, what are their identification rates? I think that's something that's been out there. Are they too high? Are they too low? But when you talk about the federal requirements to provide special ed idea, it's 3 to 21. So just because they're in a different department, they're still really part of this larger system. So they start getting identified at 3 years of age under IDEA rules and Child Find. And then those kids transition into us at 5 years of age at kindergarten. And so I think that's why you guys have been entertaining this idea with child development centers, being part of WDE and that whole conversation, because it really is one system. But currently, under the current way it's done, they're under 2 different departments. They're under the Department of Health, and 5 through 21 is through the Department of Education. So it starts with that Child Find idea. Then as a kid is identified, and I know there's a lot of questions, so you have every district's numbers of how they identify, but it's all the same. Our state has 13 disability categories that we put kids into. And as I tell parents, and the next slide you can see, these are all the disability types. So if you turn the page, you can see orthopedic, hearing impairment, all the way down to specific learning disabilities. As you can see, there are some of those categories that make up most of the areas that we identify. A lot of these orthopedic, hearing impairment, we really call them low-incident disabilities. We don't see those that often. But the ones that we really, if someone was going to over-identify, you would be probably looking at specific learning disability, possibly autism, other health impaired, and that. So when a child comes to us in a referral, they say, we suspect this child has this disability. And then we have to apply one of these 13 categories to see if they meet that criteria. This has been asked before. So these different categories have very specific criteria. So the one I know really well is like autism. Autism has 5 different areas that they say, are they lacking social communication? Are they lacking in these areas? And we do assessment to see if they meet that very rigid criteria. Specific learning disability has the same thing. Then once they meet that criteria, we say, do they have an educational need? Which is done through the general ed assessment or some of the assessment or diagnostic information that we create. Then the third question we ask is special ed what's going to help them? Is their education need so impactful that they require specialized instruction or an IEP to help them? So that's the process that all of these kids go through when they're identified. So there are systems, there are Chapter 7 rules. We do feel like, so a potential, I'm going to jump ahead, but there are some efficiencies in that. Could we do a better job of identifying what is an educational need? So an educational need for a learning disability is if your IQ is 100 and your academics, you have to have a 22-point difference. That shows a standard deviation and a half difference in their potential versus where they're actually achieving. And that's how those kids are identified. So, can we open up Chapter 7 rules, look at eligibility criteria, look at educational need to say, are we over-identifying in areas? you know, that could be a possible efficiency to look at that. Do some technical assistance training. Are we identifying the kids the same in Green River as they are in Gillette? Are we applying these rules similarly? Because the criteria for each of these is very specific. But when you get into defining what educational need means, it might be a little bit looser. So that could be a potential efficiency the WDE could potentially look into, and how districts are really applying these rules. From the CDC at 3 years of age, I wouldn't include 5-year-olds. I would go down to 3-year-olds, because that's when they're first identifying kids. And how are they identifying educational need with that? And again, just to go back to this, and then every 3 years we are mandated by federal rules that we have to reevaluate students. So they need to be reevaluated to see. Now, we're not saying, are you still disabled? We make that assumption, but we really define, do you still have an educational need, as Alan was referring to? But sometimes, because of the programming, their educational need reduces, and we're able to transition them to a 504 plan, or just out of services altogether. Or in some kids, then we start developing their IEPs, we start looking at vocational things. And so, believe it or not, I did that pretty quickly. The evaluation is a big key thing, and there's a lot of rules on it. There's a lot of devil in the details, but that's kind of a really broad, quick brush of what that process is. We have 60 days to complete it, to find those kids, to identify those. But again, I want to reiterate what Alan was saying. When you look across there, we have an opportunity to put a lot of kids in, and we don't. My experience has been is that we're really responsible with that. Special ed is we're calling kids disabled. We're telling parents their kid is disabled, and I think we forget that at times. And again, I also want to point out that Alan's not outside of Green River and puts up signs and saying, hey, check out my special ed department. It's pretty wonderful. He does a great job. But again, we get referrals. We're not recruiting kids into our services. So another potential efficiency is making tier 1 or multi-tiered systems of support to get kids what they need, because we get referrals when kids are failing, when kids aren't being successful. You can have a disability and not be put in special education. We get a lot of referrals and they say, my kid has attention deficit, but they don't meet that standard. So we have a lot of kids. I think the current data for mental health is that they say around 20 to 25% of people suffer some mental illness. We identify like 1 to 2% of kids as having an emotional disability. So there are kids who are struggling that don't get put into services. Then you turn the page, the WDE provided this information at a finer, granular level for you, but you can see where we're identifying kids. And again, it's in a lot of those areas. Speech language and specific learning disabilities and other health impairments really make up most of it. And it really goes to that academic, because it's pretty, I don't want to say easy, but an orthopedic impairment is pretty straightforward. They have a physical impairment that is so impactful that they require some assistance. You know, and that's what, those are pretty clear. If you're hearing impaired, that's pretty basic. When you get into the specific learning disability, it gets muddier. Because is it really an organic, are you dyslexic? Or have you not been exposed to reading curriculum? So there's many, I always tell anybody who will listen to me, kids come to us, and the origin of their problem can be multiple reasons why they have a reading problem. It's not always because they're disabled. But sometimes they may look disabled, but it could be because maybe they weren't exposed to reading when they were growing up, when they were young. We know the early benefit of early interventions for kids and their impact to their reading, math, and writing scores. So a lot of times those factors can really lead into why these kids are being identified. So eligibility criteria, we could look at that, possibly look at some efficiencies, see how we're doing that, provide our districts technical assistance to make sure they're applying these rules in eligibility and comprehensive evaluations, you know, make sure that they're applying it. And then I think when you have outliers, if you have a district who's 20% identification, people need to go in and see what's going on. and seeing how they're applying that. And again, that's where Alan's going back to that general oversight. I think through this whole presentation, we're not going to be able to point to one thing to you to say, fix this. This is where your problem is. Because there's a multitude of things. Some districts may be struggling with how they're identifying kids and they need help there. Some may be hiring a lot of paras. That may be their issue. But I think it's going in and looking at their data and saying, where are you above and where are you low? It is my opinion that currently under our monitoring system, they only look at see if we're missing, if I'm not providing enough services. But do they come in and provide that guidance and support the districts if they're really over-identifying in an area or if they're providing too much extended school year? Because if they're providing a lot of something, that usually equates to a lot more dollars. So that's something that they could look at as a potential savings, I would suggest, or I'd offer to you to maybe tell them to do, I guess. I don't know.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Representative Bovee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are districts that use RTI for identifying students. Do all districts use RTI? That's my first question. Do you know?
I would say no. From what I go through, and I work with a lot of different districts, they maybe have some system in place, but to identify kids with learning disabilities, I would say the answer is very few districts are utilizing RTI within that system. I know a lot of districts are looking at multi-tiered systems of support, and they may have some form or fashion of it, but to call it a system where they're identifying kids with it, very few.
So we don't know how the numbers compare between districts that are using RTI versus a discrepancy model.
Great question that I think someone could look into to see if we're seeing a benefit for those systems that are utilizing it and doing some comparing. That would be a great question to ask. I would tell you national data says that it is. We're getting kids what they need before they're failing, and that's really what we ought to do, and it's an early intervention model. So I think the journals and the information I read really says that there's a lot of hope in helping reduce our numbers by catching these kids early and getting them what they need. That just makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Further questions? Thank you.
You know, one piece I think we need to highlight too when it comes to those referrals is a parent at any time can make a referral. So they can walk in on a Monday morning after a rough weekend and say, Alan, you're going to evaluate my kid for special ed. He's got to have something. There's something going on, right? He doesn't listen to me. He doesn't do all these things. And we're obligated by law to respond. We have to do something. Whether we evaluate or not, we've got to let them know in writing what our intentions are. Now, when that happens, that triggers their protections under IDEA, the minute they do that referral. And what you're finding is in a lot of states where maybe funding is kind of directing how services are being managed, a lot of districts will not evaluate because they don't have the resources, they don't want to take the time or whichever reason, and therefore then parents have their sue card, right? You've told them, no, we're not going to evaluate this kid. Well, guess what? I'm going to sue you and make it to where you have to evaluate my kid. We're blessed in Wyoming where we still believe that kids are our priority, and so we're going to listen to parents. There are times when we don't evaluate kids. We're going to bring the parents in. We're going to talk to them. We're going to say, look, here are the two prongs, such as Dan was talking about. You've got to meet criteria, and you have to have a need. And we're going to explain that to them. Maybe their child could meet criteria. Look at autism. There was just research out just, I think, last week where 1 out of every 40 kids has autism now in the nation, right? So that means there's a lot of kids out there that have this need. However, they may not need specialized instruction. They might just need some accommodations in the classroom. They might need a teacher that understands how to work with them, some of those pieces. They might not need a full-blown IEP for that. But as soon as that parent makes that referral, we're obligated to do some things. And that means for us a comprehensive evaluation. That means we have to hire school psychologists. That's why when you're looking at staffing levels across the state, that's why even the smallest districts, such as Meeteetse, has to have a school psychologist available to perform some of these evaluations. That increases cost. They might not need to hire one full-time, but they got a contract with one. That's why in larger districts such as Cheyenne and Casper, they've got to have lots of different school psychologists because there's legal requirements that we have to do. One, every time a parent requests something, we may have to evaluate. If a student comes from out of state and they have an IEP in that state, we are obligated to evaluate them upon their entry here to see if they meet eligibility requirements in the state of Wyoming. Well, we're a pretty fluid state with our economy. With our industry, we have folks that come and go all the time. We have students a lot of times that will come for a few weeks. We're starting the evaluation process, and then they move, right? Well, we still needed to start that process. We still needed to have a body that's able to do that evaluation. So those are pieces that I think sometimes we don't talk about but that's, when we live in the trenches, those are the things that we're having to do. So as we look at efficiencies, they're not as easy as just saying, well, we're over-identifying too many kids. We're following federal rules, as the best that most districts are. I think the piece that Dan touched upon, and I think, again, the theme you're going to hear is, if you're finding in the data that's being collected, every single year we receive a data notebook that's about 6 inches thick. It's got all sorts of information, great information. But if in looking at that data, you're seeing that one district has far more students with certain kinds of disability than another, wouldn't that trigger maybe some kind of effort to go look at why that district is doing that? That's the oversight we're talking about. I came up last night from Green River, and there was probably a few of us that were not following the speed limit, I would say. I would guess, right? That doesn't mean that you're going to go out and write more laws about speed limits. You're going to enforce that by putting more patrol out there. We're telling you that be careful with putting more laws and more guidelines and more regulations out there for us to follow. There's plenty out there, trust me. If you ever take the time to read IDEA, it's plenty long. Chapter 7 rules are nice and simple. They're fairly easy to read, but there's a lot of things in there that districts have to do. We have to meet compliance requirements every year that we're measured upon. We do a fairly good job, I would say, in the state. The state has all this information. I don't believe this is necessarily a legislative issue as more as it is an oversight issue. So caution to you folks as you start looking at that work is that maybe we don't want to put more laws in there that may have unintended consequences. We really are cautious with that because for us, it restricts some of the flexibility that we may need to be able to provide those appropriate services. All right, we'll keep going if you're good. I know you're wanting to get out of here today, and we do too. So the Chapter 8 rules, I know that was just touched upon by the WDE. I think the big piece for us as an association, and we appreciate them granting our request for that public hearing, is really, are these rules going to really become an efficiency? When we look at the cost of special education, we're talking about supplies here. We're talking about some equipment cost here. Education, just like most businesses, is an 80-20. 80% of your cost goes into salaries and benefits. 20% goes into other expenditures. Very similar in special ed. Do you really feel like defining these rules and limiting some things here are gonna lead to true efficiencies? I guess that'd be a question for those folks that felt that these rules were necessary. Because they do start to limit some of the flexibility that districts have at meeting some of our requirements, such as child fine, as Dan was talking about, those evaluation costs. There are strings attached to some of those definitions, and the more definitions you put in there, the more oversight you need to provide, and the more then people are going to have to take a look and say, well, this was reimbursable, this was not, and the more you can find those, then I think the more you're going to have maybe challenges from districts saying, well, I believe this is reimbursable, and this is not, and you're going to spend a lot of time in that limbo. So we're not saying we're 100% against having those rules refined. We're just not sure that that's absolute necessary.
Representative Bovee, go ahead.
Sorry. Got
You're
questions.
good. It's good.
On the supplies question, the recommendation is not to reimburse for special ed supplies, correct?
That's correct.
That's kind of how I read it.
I don't say that it's not going to be reimbursed. It's more of that there are going to be more restrictions on what can and cannot be reimbursed.
Right.
So when we consider those restrictions, are we also considering the possibility of lawsuits if we say we will not provide those needed supplies for special ed students?
And again, apologize for not following all your forum there. I would say this. I don't know that we're necessarily going to all of a sudden see an uptick in lawsuits, because I hopefully our folks in Wyoming aren't looking at that as their go-to card. But what I am going to see is, or what I believe we're going to see is, districts starting to make decisions based on funding rather than what appropriate services are. I think just as we all do with our own budget, right? If something gets trimmed, we have to make decisions at home on what are we going to have? Are we going to have nice things here? Are we going to need requirements here? And I think that's what we're very concerned about as districts is we're going to start saying, and we're seeing it with the cap. I think you asked earlier about what are the effects of cap. I think there's districts in this room that would love to sit here and tell you how that's impacted them. Because while your intent was right on, you wanted the elephant in the room to get brought out. You wanted to talk about special ed funding. You wanted to efficiencies to be discussed. That's what your intent hopefully was in putting a cap on there, is to say, look, you have to start thinking about these things. And people are. That's why we're here. I think districts are collaborating. We're looking at efforts that we can come up with efficiencies. But it's also put some really some tough times on some districts that can't afford some of these things. And now they're saying, well, we're capped. And now we're not going to be able to afford having this student go to an out-of-district placement. So what are we going to do? We're going to keep this student in our district because we don't have the reserves potentially to place this student here, or we don't feel like that's an appropriate way of using those funds. And now that student may be unsafe. They're in the school. They may hurt someone. They may hurt themselves. And we've made a decision that's not based on what's the best interest of that student because we're worried about the cost associated with it. That's the piece that we're worried about.
And I would add to that if you look at other states that have a lot more complaints and those type of things, that's what it's about. It's about not providing what people felt like that was needed. It comes down to the financial. So does it increase that risk or that question? I think it does because of those things. If you're making decisions about money around the table and not what's in the best interest of the child, it's going to put you more at risk, and I think you're going to get more conflict. Right now, we don't, I mean, we think about that financial aspect, but we have I think the key is flexibility to be able to provide what we need. It's hard when kids come in with these diverse needs, and you can't just flock shot a special ed kid and what their needs are to be able to say, this one can have this and this one can't. The flexibility has been greatly benefited because it allows us to provide what the need is and not have to always be worried about that. But again, we have to come up with the money. It's refunded in the rears. So it's still, we have to go to our board. We have to go to the right channels to say, this is a need that we have and we need to put some money from somewhere for this, but we know there's a little bit of a safety net because we can get that reimbursed to us. So it helps us do our job and not get into those unnecessary conflicts because we're like, no, the child doesn't need it, but it's really because it's based upon money. And that's clearly we're not supposed to be making decisions because our budget can't sustain a high needs kid needs a certain level of service. That's quite clear in IDEA rules. Your decision you should not be sitting around the table. We should not have the business manager on part of the IEP team saying we don't have the budget for this, because it's supposed to be about the child. That's how they train us, and that's what that's about. But of course, we have finances in our mind. We want to be frugal with our resources and only use them if we need to and if it's really a need. And districts go through those channels. I don't think they're willy-nilly with those special ed resources. So,
Representative Pieper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dan, what happens to the supplies if they're not consumables? What happens to the inventory of supplies when the child no longer needs it and it can be utilized for other needs?
So oftentimes we have transitioned them to other districts. Districts, now that I'm Region 5 BOCES, districts will provide me those materials, so we'll share them. We'll give them to other kids when they have those, and then we put it on a shelf and see if another kid may need it. We've had a lot of, I think they just made a flexible rule where, I believe you had a hearing impaired kid that required some FM system. Child came in, Alan got all prepared, the kid moved in 3 weeks, right after he got his stuff. And I had a similar student when I was the director in Evanston. And we were talking about sharing that because it was bought through federal funds to possibly be able to share that. So with some of these consumables, we try to be, careful with that, but there are times where we'll share with other people if it's no longer a need and get rid of those. But a lot of the curriculum consumables, we spend a lot of money, like if we've adopted reading mastery as our intervention, we've invested a lot of time and a lot of resources towards that. So we're using it with a lot of students. And so if it's one kid, where it becomes problematic is when you have a really, like for a hearing impaired child or an orthopedic kid where they need a stander and it's built for them and then they leave, but now they're allowing Medicaid dollars or their waiver dollars to buy some of these things. So if we buy a life vest for a kid to teach them swimming, we're able to buy that and then reduce that cost. So they've allowed some flexibility, because back a while ago, I couldn't even let the parents have something that was fitted for the kid because it was district property. But we've changed some of those rules now because it just didn't make sense. So we're trying to be smarter about that and maybe letting those parents buy that from the district and putting that money to another resource.
Other questions? Please proceed.
Great. I think we can definitely keep going on supplies. I think, again, we have to look at, is that a true efficiency? When we look at I think staffing is probably where you're looking at. I think those low incident students, those are expensive kids. With the advances in the medical field, you're seeing the advances in equipment, and that equipment's not cheap. And we want to make sure that our students are getting those appropriate pieces. So as Dan was saying, a lot of times I know from our district, it is state funds, so we can share those resources with another district at no cost to just send that to them and say, great, this student's going, say, between Rock Springs and Green River, we have several kids that will transition back and forth. We're able to say, they're bringing all of these equipment with them, and then off they go. Or as Dan was mentioning, the waivers, has been nice to be able to sell some of these items to students as they leave, as they age out, when they're 21. We can say, great, they had the communication device. Some of those are closer to $10,000, but that's their voice. We might say, why don't we sell it to you at that depreciated value? And then that way, it's just not sitting for another student that may not be able to use that device. That person can actually go on into their post-secondary life and use those. So, great ways.
Should I jump into Medicaid?
I think so. I think the next one's a big ticket item, right? It's Medicaid.
Medicaid, government efficiency, that group that's doing that work, Alvarez, they've reached out to several of us. They've reached out to me to talk to me about Medicaid and regionalization. And, you know, again, generally, I think WASIA is in support of looking at this. I think we understand the financial need that's out there. What our concern is that, is it really going to be, we need to do a cost-benefit analysis, and I told Alvarez this. I currently, in my system, bill Medicaid. And over the last 3 years, what I can bill for has been significantly reduced because of the changes in Medicaid. We don't have a school-friendly Medicaid system. Our state plan is not set up for districts to come in. I'm a school psychologist. If I'm providing therapy to a kid, if I'm doing testing, those are all billable hours, but not under our plan. I can't bill Medicaid. So you have a whole bunch of people. You have counselors who are working with kids. The only ones that can bill Medicaid are if they're a licensed professional counselor. So again, when they're doing these estimates, what are they basing that off? How many billable people do the districts really have? That's the question we need to know. Anymore now, even if we want to bill for occupational therapy, we have to have a medical doctor prescribe that service in our current plan. So right now, even up at Region 5 BOCES, where we have the capacity, we bill Medicaid, it's very limiting. And so, again, it's not easy just to go out and do it. I've heard rumblings that some districts are going to maybe start dabbling in it and seeing if they can benefit that. All three BOCES, the residential BOCES I like to call them, not the BOCES, but the ones that work in just special ed, have offered to say, we bill currently. We would be happy to set up a system. I've testified before. I went up to Montana to look at their educational service agencies, and that's what they're doing. They're looking at the model. But they're also have, I mean, there's again, you're working with a whole other department. It's the Department of Health that you guys have to work with to say, is this going to be feasible? Because if we do start doing this, this is a whole lot of work for our staff. Now we're looking at staffing efficiencies. So reduce staff, have that. And then we're going to add a whole requirement. Medicaid's not easy. It's just not free money. They have a lot of, you think IEPs have a lot of We have to do an IEP, and we've got to collect quarterly goals. When you bill Medicaid, you have to document all those services. So it's going to increase their workload. So our providers are going to go, I don't want to bill Medicaid. I'm glad the state's getting, because it's a whole lot of work. And so again, as we're looking at reducing staffing, we're going to do that, and it might be an increase to staff because it's going to be a ton of paperwork for them to do that. So I am in full support. I know Alan is in full support. I know many of us are exploring this to see if this could really substantially bring some money into the state. There's maintenance of effort problems, so we can't, it might be a nice supplement. And I think you guys are becoming real aware of some of the nuances with that. We're here to say we'd be happy to sit down. I've been talking with individuals to figure out a system that we can do. I think it can be done, but again, if we're going to put all this work into it and it's not going to recapture the amount of money and we're spending more to get, that's what I'm worried about, is it's going to cause all this work and it's not going to really reap the benefit. So I think that really needs to be analyzed, and I'm telling you right now, the state rules need to be addressed. If we want to get a full benefit of it, we need to really address those state rules to make sure it's working. So all speech-language pathologists can bill for school-based services. All occupational therapies can do that. All school psychologists can bill for a school-based Medicaid service. Currently, we don't have that system. It's very limited. And I know that firsthand because we bill. And our reimbursements have gone down dramatically because we don't have a medical doc. Now we're going to have to contract a medical doctor to bill Medicaid for our districts and for DFS and department. I mean, that just raises our costs. That's a cost raise for us. They're going to want to get paid. They're not going to do it pro bono for us, So we're in favor of it. There's some slippery slopes with that, and I shared all of that with Alvarez to give them a better picture of what the state of Medicaid really is in our state. But again, I leave that with being that could bring some dollars in, but there are some nuances to it. I'll take the next one, the concern.
Dan,
Yep.
one piece to remember too is in our state right now, we've got a shortage of speech pathologists, occupational therapists, school psychologists, and those are the positions that you're going to be able to bill Medicaid for. Because teachers you're not going to be able to bill Medicaid for. They're not providing a medical service. So you're already taking shortages in those staff members, and now you're going to put on additional requirements for them to look at compliance efforts in terms of filling out billing information. And our concern is we're already having a tough time providing a service to students. Now we're going to just inundate them with more clerical work, which is going to take time away from them providing services to students just to see if we can make a few dollars on the back end. I think the estimated dollars were $6 million, I think, that could come in terms of Medicaid reimbursement funds. Again, I'm not sure if that's a true efficiency. $6 million is a lot of money, don't get me wrong.
And I'm not sure if that's a true number.
But when we take a look at all those things, there needs to be a lot more further study that needs to be done. I think we're willing to sit down with you and explore that. How can it be done? But it needs to be a cost benefit. And right now, we're just concerned that many districts across our state, if you look at the School Boards Association postings in the fall or throughout the summer, we're all searching for school psychs. We're all searching for speech pathologists and occupational therapists. We're taking one to rob the other and stealing from this one, and that's all we're doing because we can't get them in here. And that's a national epidemic. It's not just here in Wyoming. I think it's going to come to an efficiency. We can talk about it a little bit, how we can help each other. But I do share that concern with you that those additional clerical pieces may really put a stress on folks. And the comment we're hearing from our speech folks is, if you're going to make me bill Medicaid, why don't I just go private? Why don't I go private, and I'll just bill you by the hour, then I can make more money myself. I've got to do this paperwork anyways. And now districts are going to have to pay more for the same service they were receiving to really to get a cost benefit on the Medicaid billing. So I think those are the unintended consequences that we want you to be aware of that's out there, that these people can go out on private and charge you $200 an hour when we're currently probably only paying them a lot less than that. So I think those are things we've got to consider.
However, with that being said, I believe there are systems that we could model that could make it more efficient. Again, I think there needs to be a lot of thought into it, again, to make sure we don't have those unintended consequences. I've seen some states or some regions that have been doing it for their districts, and they created a pretty slick system. So, I mean, there's, with technology, I think it's making it not so burdensome, but it is an added burden. And again, I really worry even the 6 million. I want to see that in hard numbers of where they're getting that from, just because of some of my struggles. And it could be true, and I shouldn't be, but I would really want to know that, where they're coming up with that, where they're basing that off of. Representative Bovee, you were asking the WDE if we're going into the impact and reduction of at-risk funding and CDC funding and DFS funding. And again, this is an area that I know. I worked in the districts. I was a special ed director for UNT County's School District number 1 and number 4 for about 10 years. And then I moved into this other side. So I have a good perspective now of this whole system when we talk about out-of-district placements and you see these residential costs. I don't know the number that you asked about the cuts to the Department of Health, but it happened several years ago, and it's severely reduced. I mean, I was in a meeting this summer with a kid from Gillette, and they said, we're out of money. We need to send this kid home. And we fought that tooth and nail. And so that's very real in my world, that's happening. And I was very concerned because I don't feel like this student probably should have been back at the school that they were attending because of some of the issues they had. There were some serious issues. We talk about school safety. You know, that's another topic that you guys are addressing. This comes right in here. We deal with that day in and day out. And so it's a real thing. But the problem is that these kids' needs don't go away because we don't have money. It just gets cost shifted to somewhere else. I was looking at the longitudinal data since I knew this residential, the DFS situation, and I remember looking, and I couldn't find it, but it was in our SPED efficiency meetings with the WDE this May. They were showing the 401, which is our reimbursable costs. And for me, I saw people make up about 90% of that. Contracts and people make up 90% of that 401. I think it's like 88, 89. It's approaching 90% of that is people. That's something that's why we talk about Chapter 44 rules. What kind of dent is that going to do when you're talking about a few equipment when 90% of that is people? And that's where those efficiencies come in. But they also had a separate column for out-of-district placements of what districts are getting reimbursed for the kids that they place in as a district. And there was about a $2 or $3 million jump. And it was about the same time of 2014 and 2015. So it was around like 11 and it jumped up to like 13, 14. I wanted to bring that information to compare and contrast because I feel like, and I think a lot of districts, in my conversations, they're sitting across meetings and it's like it's a family issue and they're feeling like they're being put upon to possibly place this kid when it's not an educational issue. When districts place it, it's because they can't handle that kid. When it's a home issue, it's supposed to be through the human services and social services. But if they don't have money to place those kids, it could be, so we're getting into awkward conversations with that of whose job is it to do this. So we know that the Department of Health has been cut, and what are the first things to get cut? We hear from our colleagues at CDCs that they're not able to do some of the things that they need to do because of some of the cuts they have, and they're running into staffing crises because, again, all of our budgets are people. And so to get people, you have to pay people, and you need to be competitive in your market. And when they don't have the money, they're running into troubles with that. We're seeing that these kids, you know, so how does that impact? That when other departments, what I want you guys to walk away from this is that your other legislators and other departments, if they're making cuts, that could have an unintended consequence to us because, as I've reported to you guys before, we are oftentimes the first line of mental health for a lot of these families, especially in our small communities. I've heard numbers that we have like 3 or 4 psychiatrists in our state, or some number like that. We're contracting, like in the Southwest, we have someone telehealth in from University of Utah in Salt Lake. And so a lot of times we are the largest providers of mental health services in our communities, and they're coming to us. So When these community resources are gone, where are they going to go? They're coming to us. And when their needs aren't being met in the communities, I provided a document to Matt. Did you hand that out to them? Thank you. It's titled WISA on the top, and it gives you more details from that group. They work with labor and health, and they're testifying to some of the cuts that they've received and the funding they're doing. And so I'm part of that group. I'm part of WASIA. And I said to my colleagues, I said, I find it interesting that we're cutting these social services as another body of legislators is talking about how do we help kids in crisis. And our community resources seem to be not there as much as they once were. Our group homes are becoming at risk. Some of those prevention dollars through mental health and substance abuse dollars aren't there. For my colleagues in the Youth Services Association to provide those supports for these families when it's not a school issue. But when those resources aren't there or drying up, or who do they go to? They go to the school. They go to the school and say, help me with this. Alan was just telling me over breakfast this morning, we're doing some contract work with him. I was asking about one of our clinical psychs that's working for him. How many threat assessments has she done for you in the last 2 weeks? 4 or 5? 4? Yeah, it's real. So it's issues of suicide coming to the school, and they're going in and doing these threat assessments, and that, you know, not to give too many details, but there was a couple serious situations he had to deal with that student. And again, I feel like you need to understand that it's this whole picture, and as one decreases, it may put upon the schools, because we're viewed as that, especially in Wyoming, especially with our unique situation. And again, I think it's something, I've heard other testimony of some of the work Dr. Brown was testifying when he was in Gillette, of some of the things that they're doing as it's really in the social services realm to help and support these families when they're in these crises, because they bring those crises to school. And I think we're seeing that more and more, and it's why you guys are looking at statutes to, you know, have secure schools and mental health services and those type of things to make sure we have security. So is there anything in this realm that I can speak to?
Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we've got a lot of information, and I think a lot of us are aware of all the challenges you're talking about. I want to go back, though. We're one of the few states, though, that doesn't bill for Medicaid.
Yep.
I think that's the problem,
Yep.
is we're asking, how did all these other states figure it out? Why are we we can't be that special of an outlier? So, I mean, we've listened to your testimony, and then my takeaway is you're asking us to do nothing, I think. Is that what I'm hearing? Or, how do we fix that Medicaid piece then? I mean, you're saying—
you need to go to the department that oversees the state plan, the Department of Health, and see what that plan can do and what the actual return will be.
Mr. Chairman, if we could start finding a way to put some meat on the bones of this request, because it is troublesome to me that we're one of the few states that hasn't figured it out.
Senator Ellis, I've gone and had this meeting. I went to Montana to learn how they did the system. I'm more than happy to bill for the districts to create a model and a system. We just want to make sure we get the benefit from it. There's a lot of details to it that need to be investigated. We can't just go bill. That's my point. There needs to be some groundwork laid before we do it. If there's money that we can receive to help our state, we should go after it. 100% agree with you. I'm just saying it's not as easy as just doing it. And I feel like that's what I hear a lot. Well, why aren't we just doing it? Well, there's a lot of nuances to it. There's a lot of barriers that you guys don't have control over. It's through a whole other department. Are they willing to sit down? I've sat down in some of these meetings, and we need to get these departments to work together to figure this out, not me. I'd be happy to be part of that solution. I have some great ideas of how it can look, but there's some things I don't control. I don't control that state plan, but I know there's problems with it. So no, I don't think do nothing. I think we need to get other players involved to make sure it'll be a profitable endeavor for our districts.
Go ahead, Senator Ellis.
I guess, Mr. Chairman, to follow up, it's just sitting on this side, so what is the plan, like the next step of getting the stakeholders? You know, you provided us with this documentation. Maybe if you provided us with those elements in Medicaid that you see are a problem. I'm just trying to think of how we move the ball forward,
Yep.
because I don't know that I've heard that.
Okay,
Other
I've
than we need to work
contacted-
on it some more.
Yep. I've contacted State Department people. I gave Alvarez the government efficiency. They're looking at that. I told them all the steps I've done, the meetings that I've had. Again, I think it's when it becomes interdepartment, this is going to be something that's going to impact Department of Health, Department of Finance, and Department of Education across all those mechanisms. And that's the difficult piece to that.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead, Matt.
and just to that point, in Senator Ellis, there are multiple avenues that this is being discussed. In 2017, the Labor Health Committee had a presenter on this issue. The Government Efficiency Commission is working on this issue. They're going to present their information to the Joint Appropriations Committee in December during the budget hearings. There's no committee that's taking the charge on this. This Education Committee hasn't gone that route. And so I think perhaps it's Management Council assign both the Labor Health Committee and Joint Education Committee next year to really study the nuances with this issue to go forward and come up with a bill draft, if that's the plan, or do we let the Government Efficiency Commission take the lead on that? I think that there's a lot of arrows, and I don't know if they're all aligned right now, and I understand the frustration.
Thank you, Matt. That was what I had. My notes was to just ask Management Council about that, so thank you. Please proceed.
I think we hear you that you're wanting to hear efficiencies, obviously, and wanting to hear how we can trim back some of the cost. I think what we're also wanting to highlight is it's not cheap to educate our most needy students. I think that even though 60% of our kids are in the general ed classroom, you can't also cut their funding when our kids are in there and asking them to do more with less. So it's an all education piece, but some of these kids are expensive. And that's the next part we're wanting to talk about is our out-of-district placement kids and our most at-risk students that are requiring the most needs, and really taking a look at, can we look at residential placement centers in our state for more of a day treatment program rather than a 24-hour care program? So I know that in our district, in our region, Rock Springs, Green River, potentially Mountain View, we've got a day program that services students that are not a good match for our high school, not a good match for our elementary schools, for whatever reason. Maybe their needs are such that it's not an appropriate setting. Maybe they've had a disciplinary act. Maybe they've committed a crime. Any of those kind of pieces. And they're able to take those students where we don't have to send those kids out of district to a residential placement at sometimes 3 to 4 times the cost. So by doing a regionalized kind of day program, that's an efficiency that you can explore. But there needs to be incentives for doing those, whether it's from BOCES, whether it's a WDE that looks at other agencies that could provide this service. I think there's a need across our state. You're hearing about all these kids that are needing out of district cost, these tough kids, mental health is going up. You're seeing all this data come up. Great, what do we do about it? This is one way that I know in our district we've been able to reduce significantly our out-of-district cost by having students go to a day program rather than 1 or 2 going out of district to maybe a BOCES program at a much larger cost. Now, not saying that we don't have a need for those BOCES programs from time being. They're providing a service that other agencies maybe are not able to. But that is one area that you can explore efficiencies, is regionalizing services. We've talked about that before. We use Region 5 BOCES. They provide Roosevelt Learning Center for us. I know they've got, I think, 3 different day programs now. And that's a reduced cost for districts, where you're having to only spend a fraction of what it costs to send them to out of district. Dan, did you want to speak to that at all? Or?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we started trying to provide out of there, at least in Sweetwater County, again, I've testified to this, that Rock Springs, Evanston, and Green River all were short school psychologists. We were able to secure those. So we've contracted to provide, I think we have 2 or 3 people, and I think we're providing for about 4 or 5 positions across there. I think it's something we're learning, we're trying to do. I feel like the issue is how do we create this model, the statewide system across the state, we're asking people to regionalize and to be able to find those efficiencies, and I know Alvarez is looking into that as well. But if we don't have a system for them to go to be more efficient, to share, what can they do? So I think, and again, one thing I learned from going around and visiting with other people who are doing this work in other states is that it can't be legislatively mandated. We need to go into the districts and say, how do we help you? How do we help you? Because the end goal is that if we can help you save money here, you'll have more money to spend in other places that where you maybe would prefer to do that. And so it's got to be a mind shift, and if that can help that. But we don't really have a system that's built to help districts start to do that. And I think we're starting to try to do that. And so I think there's been some real good momentum built into that. But again, it's just not something you can snap your finger and have. It's more complex than that to be able to provide that. And we're looking at other ways and working with districts and say, how can we do that? And so we're building it slowly but surely moving forward. And then you can see across with this, with the efficiencies on this page, when you look at the state budget, we're not growing incrementally more than what the budget, you know. When you look at special ed expenditures and the total expenditures for the state, it's very similar and at times on par to how the rest of the state's growing. So really when it comes down to it is that when teachers get steps and increases, that's really what's causing it. I've heard rumblings that it's, you know, we get sticker shock with how much it costs to place kids. When we don't have any other funding mechanism, we get this sticker shock. But at the end of the day, I met with a director, and he really wanted to talk about it, but he looked at me, he's like, this is less than 1% of my total special ed budget. I'm like, yeah, I know, but it's just, it opens your eyes to what these kids costs when you're doing that. Does that mean we shouldn't look at finding ways to be more efficient ourselves and reduce costs to help the state? Absolutely not. One thing that I wanted to suggest, and I wanted to have the bill, so it might be in my notes, but there's a bill that if districts work together, and you guys have looked at that and how shared that, they could get like 50% of the savings that they did, like if they shared a staff. My question was always, could BOCES be included on that? It almost de-incentivizes them to work through us. They get more of a cost saving and an incentive if they work with each other, but if I could help go to Sweetwater County and he's saving, he needs 3 psychs, that's what they're offering, and we're able to do it at a reduced rate for that, and his needs are being met, shouldn't that district get that savings as well, maybe? And then I know there's a statute or there's a bill out there that allows that, and I didn't know if that could be possibly to encourage people to find these centers to go and try to share services more, but it's limited to only district to district. So that
I hate to ask, but guys, speed it up just a little bit. We're starting to burn time.
Okay. Well, I think the next piece is important maintenance of effort. It's been brought up to the legislation before as a concern. This will highlight a recent ruling in Texas that was November of this year. And so we're not going to go into great detail on that. I think you're all educated, and you can definitely look that up on your own. But really the intent of this ruling was that the state of Texas decided to freeze their funds and reduce funds as an effort to, again, do a cost benefit. And in doing that, people were making decisions that were based on funding rather than student need. And it came out to the bill of, I think, $33 million. And they found that was not something that they should have done because it violated federal law. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on that. I think it'd be worth your while to educate you on that court case. I think there's a couple others out there that are kind of rumbling now, but this is kind of a big deal in the special ed world because this is when, again, government starts getting involved with how we're providing services and the danger of that. We talked about dispute resolution, so we're not going to go into great detail. You've got the data here. I think the WD probably has even more recent data. When you look at percentages, because we're such a small state in terms of population, our percentages sometimes look fairly similar to other states. But I think what this shows you is that we're not having a whole lot of lawsuits in Wyoming. That's a good thing. We should see that as a good thing. And that's because we're able to provide appropriate services. We need to have that flexibility. Now, we do need to look at efficiencies, but I think that in the same time, we're getting the job that you asked us to do, we're getting it done. So if that's not what we're supposed to do, then you need to let us know if you're wanting different outcomes. But we're getting kids to graduate, we're getting kids to get jobs, to go to college, and we're doing it so without having to fight with parents to do it. So I think those are some big points. All right, so let's get to the so what can we do about it? I think that this is an important piece. Dan's done some work in looking at the state of Vermont, and they're in the same boat as we are. They're fairly similar in terms of their demographics, and they have been tackled with the same task of looking at special education funding. What they have done is gathered a team to really dig down and take a look at that. We've provided you a link here where you can go into and look at their document. It's fairly lengthy. Dan, I'll let you kind of discuss that a little bit more.
As we started talking about this, interesting enough, Vermont is one of the only other states that uses state funds to fund special education. And about a year ahead of you guys, they said, holy cow, this funding is getting out of hand. And we need to study this because we can't continue this. The trend's going up and we need to figure something out. So about 2 years ahead of you, they've been doing the same thing, but they've taken a little bit different process into it. So they've really studied it and they found different efficiencies and they've made recommendation. What I like about what they've done is they recognize the good work that's happening in districts and saying, how do we save that and make this more cost neutral and possibly cost reduction? And again, it's not so much what we're doing day to day and working with these kids. It's a lot about, they talk a lot about multi-tiered systems of support. They talk about, we place a lot of paraprofessionals in front of our most needy kids. We need to get more trained individuals and just kind of re-looking at it and realizing to change that system, it's going to take 3 to 5 years. But again, I would recommend anybody that can get this link. They have some really good recommendations and they're pretty similar in how they've been funding it and they're asking the same questions you are. And I feel like when I read it, it's very similar. I think it's, their conclusions, I think we could make the same conclusions in Wyoming.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about oversight, because I think that is a big issue that we feel maybe can be provided to look at some of those efficiencies. There's a lot of data that gets collected every year. I mean, the WDE collects all this data already. There's the 401, there's staffing data. They provide different indicators to where they know exactly how many kids are in which environments. All of those pieces are already out there. Our goal would be to maybe help the WDE in, what do we do with all this data? Are we just looking at it? Great, we've collected it. Or are we actually looking at it and saying, we should go to see this district is why this is happening and this is happening? Are those conversations happening? The WDE has a pretty robust compliance department in terms of their monitoring. We're wondering, is that really all of the efforts that need to be done, or can we be looking at, are there other things that should be explored? Such as, if you have so many speech pathologists compared to a district your same size, why is that? What are you doing over here that's different than over here? And those are some of those outliers that we feel could be done through an oversight rather than additional cuts, additional regulations in those pieces. The flexibility of the rules around the RDA is the monitoring piece. Again, that's a WDE task. I think that as they're looking at that, I know they're working on their monitoring process, really taking a look at, can they put some systems in place to go in and help districts at looking at what they can do to efficiently meet those student needs, rather than just right now how, hey, great, you're meeting student needs, we don't care how you're doing it, keep doing it, right? So those are pieces that I think, again, are an oversight issue. The collaboration with school districts, again, has this been an incentive around the state to say, great, can we localize our PD? Can I provide a professional development for one district as well as all the other districts around me? What are the incentives to do that? Same with positions. So right now, we contract with Dan for a variety of reasons, but one of them is it's cost effective for me to do so. I'm saving the state around $150,000 based on school psychologist funds to get the same service. And he's able to also meet some services in Rock Springs. He's also able to meet some services at the Child Developmental Center. That means that all those folks, we don't have to go and hire. We all get those folks from right here. Are there ways that we can incentivize to do this throughout the state? We know that people aren't able to find people. So when they can find one, they hire them. And they may not need them for the full position, but they hire them anyways because they might need them for a quarter. Those are not efficient ways of staffing your building. But they're a way that you do it because it's a necessity. So I think those are pieces we've got to explore at the state level. Can the WDE provide those regional centers? That might be another way. I know that in other states, the BOCES provide those regional services around. Texas has a huge one where they're providing school psych services to a whole entire region, where districts often don't even have to hire their own. Same with speech pathologists. I can't find them, he can, for whatever reason that might be. So at the same time, I can contract with him. That means that I'm not going out of state to do so. We can keep our funds local. Those are all ways that I think we can get more efficient with our staffing that we haven't necessarily been explored. We did it out of necessity. I couldn't find school psychs. I had no applicants. He had multiple ones through Jackson. That's a necessity. As we go through, we've also highlighted that early intervention efforts are obviously gonna have a drawback. If you're cutting those funds, we've hit on that. That's gonna have an end cost to special ed. If you're not providing interventions to students through RTI, then they're eventually gonna keep falling behind and probably ending up in special ed for us to clean up. We've talked about low incident positions. So has it been explored for districts instead of us trying to go find a vision specialist and paying that person, again, a full salary for one student? Has it been explored that these could be outreach services? Same with deaf and hard of hearing. Same with behavior. All of those services. We're spending a lot of money on that at the local level because those are not available to us at any other level. Looking at that data again for those checks and balances, I think is a way that we should really take a look at those efficiencies. You asked again about the cap and if that's meeting needs. I'll caution you that if you put a cap, most districts are going to go right to that number, however they're going to get there, because they don't know what their cost is going to be for special ed the next year and the year after. I can't predict what students move into my district. But if I go down, if I lose some students and I lower my cap, then the next year I've just pigeonholed myself to where I'm not able to maybe provide services for that new student. So I don't think you're going to see a huge drop in cost with the cap because everybody's going to make it to the top level and just spend as much as they can. If you remove the cap, it provides flexibility. And now you can look at incentivizing districts that if you do have a drop in enrollment, which then is a good cost for the MOE to go down, that's one of the only reasons MOE can go down is if you have a decrease in needs, then we can start looking at, great, you didn't have as many funds this year, but next year if you need more, we'll get you those funds and make sure you get reimbursed. That's the piece that we've got to start exploring. Those are efficiencies. We understand that we don't have a magic bullet. We're not coming in here telling you we can get you $25 million. We understand that. But there are things that can be done that I think in dialogue that can be done to get us there. So in conclusion, I think we're offering to provide you any support as you go on with any of these tasks. If you're looking at the Medicaid and some of those pieces, we're definitely wanting to sit with you and sit at the table and have that discussion. But before you act on anything specific, we would appreciate if you gave us a heads up so we could give you some of those unintended consequences. So.
Very good. Thank you. Thanks, guys. Any questions for the gentleman? Thank you very much. I'd like to ask the department back up to ask a couple of questions that arose after the discussion, one of them being the RTI. Is she back? I saw her run out. I saw. And Dickie, maybe you're not the person to be asking, but they talked about a multi-level of support that could reduce costs. Is there anything in the department along that lines? Is there anything that's there?
Mr. Chairman, committee members, Dickie Shaner, Department of Ed, thank you. Our resident expert on RTI is not present. However, our chief academic officer is out in the hallway on the phone right now getting some information for you guys. So hopefully we can get her in here very soon to respond to that. We also, in fact, contract with Mr. Mayor, who you just heard from, to do that RTI work. So we contract out expertise in that area. In terms of the MTSS work, again, that's in our academic group, and we'll have Chief Academic Officer Ham will talk to you about that as well.
Okay.
But I can certainly try to answer any other questions if you have them.
Do you have a question?
I'm wondering about just taking a break.
Okay, so let's do that. Let's take a 10-minute break while Ms. Hamill gets her questions answered, and we'll come back. So we'll be back here at 20 after 10. Thank you.
Thank you.